that basically Clive said, the projections for the future looking grim, and I wonder, the words that you used in your piece were an unscientific fantasy world. Do you want to defend that? Is there science you can bring to bear?
Well, no, I'll start out by agreeing that the trajectories are grim. I mean, I've never said that we're not in a that we're. I've never said this is a good moment in the history of the planet. What I've been trying to say, sometimes perhaps not being specific enough, is that it's possible to have a good trajectory in a turbulent time. You do the best you can, but you have to be realistic about what's possible, given what we know about our species, about our personal behavior, about our social behavior, and our inability to act on long time scales, for the most part, is one of the key impediments to us getting things right, in the sense that we'll always be having regrets. I mean, I've written already a couple of different obituaries for the New York Times about species that have gone out, the Baiji and the Yangtze River, and I've written about the unbelievable transformations of ecosystems that right now we don't really appreciate. The great depletion of the ocean's fish species, what's happening with the great mammals of Africa right now because of our appetite for luxuries like rhino horn and ivory in some parts of the world. And of course we did the same thing here in North America, and we kind of conveniently forget about that. So no, there's been lots of reasons for woe is me and shame on you, as I said in my talk. But going forward from here, the point I'm trying to make is, how do you carve a creditable path forward, given what we understand about not just the habits that I mentioned, but the disparities on the planet, the fact that a third of us have had our fossil fuel party, and a third have not even begun, and a third are kind of in the middle, and the primacy of energy access in virtually every place I've been on the planet trumps long-term concerns like what we're going to do to the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere.
Well, I mean, we're at one on that. I mean, that's the awful problem, but I think probably the difference, Andy, is that I think you said, in your view, things can be good, whereas I would say, things can be better than they're otherwise going to be. But I can't see how, in a world warmed by 4 degrees, anything can be described as good. And so the question is whether we think we're headed for 4 degrees or not. And that's when you come down to looking at the trajectories that the IPCC and other scientists are making, and then making a judgment about. And they say, well, in order to limit warming to 2 degrees, we're going to have to, global emissions are going to have to peak in 2020 or something like that, 2025 at most, with very steep reductions after that. And you have to say, well, under any reasonable assessment of what's going to happen, can we expect that? And that's why when you look at the global emissions budget, we can see that it's just going to be blown out way beyond the 2 degrees limit. And, as Kevin Anderson and Alice Bose said, probably beyond the 4 degrees limit. And when you actually really, you have a kind of oh shit moment at some point, and you realise that, the way one used to think about how can we get out of this, how can we manage it so that things will be okay, how are we going to muddle through, those kinds of approaches to a problem as monumental and earth transformative as this really won't do anymore. That we're in a completely different and vastly more momentous environment, political and social environment than we've ever faced.
Well,
it seems to me
Well, one thing I just want to introduce is that, and I think, Clive, you recognize this, the 2 degrees threshold was not set by science, but by policymakers. The scientific underpinnings are a sliding scale. They always have been. They always will be. And don't take my word for it. Go back to the pieces that Gavin Schmidt, who now runs the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, has written repeatedly on the fantasy of those kinds of tipping points. And that those thresholds are perceptual; they're not real.
But well, that's only because there is no threshold for dangerous climate change. But look, I mean, and the Europe set it, the 2 degrees target, quite a few years ago, the so-called European guardrail. But look, it doesn't bother me. I mean, if we could get to 2 degrees, whatever that might mean for environmental impact, it would be vastly better than 3 degrees or 4 degrees.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. But this is why the other key point in my talk was, to my mind, when you have, as you've laid out, end points that you don't know how to reach. In other words, given what we know about trajectories for fossil fuel use, and what we do know about the scale of rising risk with rising temperature on various fronts. When you don't know how to get there, just keeping chanting numbers like 2 degrees or 350 or 80 by 2050 to me is less useful than looking around and saying, what are the traits in society and individuals that I can work on that give us the best chance of bending curves in directions we think are quote-unquote good. And when I do identify, in this case, 8, but that's anyone can make up their own list of traits that give us a chance of doing the best we can with the knowledge we have now, and also giving us the best chance to have the culture and the individual capacity to take advantage of these shifts in knowledge that are going to be occurring year by year. Just think about the things that we didn't know just a few years ago, some good and some bad. No one had any idea we were going to have a natural gas revolution, for better or worse, and here it is now reshaping global energy policies. So what do you do when you have a situation globally where you know the things that you don't know are the things that are going to matter most in coming years? Well, you build in systems and norms for being agile, for being collaborative, for making sure the good idea gets to the right place at the right time. And when you do that, I think you can end up with a sense of doing your best. And just getting back to the science one more time, whether you're talking about climate sensitivity, the basic, we still have this. Things could be worse than we thought, but they could also be better than a lot of scientists think. And if you have the odds in both ends, you need agility. You need the ability to learn and adjust. And those are traits that can be maximized. There are ways to work on that.
I think so. Just I think it might be helpful to move this along. It seems to me that perhaps the real difference in opinion here is about how to talk about this. And do we point positive or do we point negative? Is it more effective to show people, hey, this is possible, or to point out that this is horrible?
Well, I mean, one thing I've said, and then I'll flip it back to Clive, is, and this is for a number of years now, the environmental movement, the core of the sort of climate-focused, climate-centric environmental movement has been very reluctant to acknowledge the need for diversity. And I don't mean ethnic diversity. The environmental movement is mostly white and middle class, but I'm talking about diversity of views and goals among those seeking a better planet, using just a common sense of what we think of as good. And when I say that, I'm talking about, like I mentioned in my lecture, you've got George Monbiot in England and Bill McKibben in the United States, both championing climate action. And when Fukushima happened, each one had a completely opposite reaction. Bill said it was a sign of the brittleness of this technology, we can't use it. And George said it shows that it could stand up even to the worst possible damage without a total meltdown. And can you say you're going to have endless fights about who's right or wrong when both have the goal of decarbonization? I think that would be a waste of time. So how do we, and I don't know the answer, how do we incorporate diversity in the face of these kinds of challenges in how to get there?
Well, it's a fair question. I think it's not so much. The problem is that diversity allows can be exploited. Put it that way. And I think when you have a bunch of people who are environmentalists who are saying, look, essentially we are optimistic. We believe that human beings will solve this with technology. We're working with business to help them come up with the solutions. I think that detracts from the urgency, and that's why I said it's unscientific, because that whole approach fails to grasp the seriousness of the situation that the science tells us is appropriate. And so what happens is that
can you say why? Is that because because of the politics of opposition that it favors these fossil fuel corporations to stop the development of other forms of energy, or is that what you mean?
Well, essentially what it does is that kind of approach that I just outlined it ignores or skates over the fundamental problem here, and that is the exercise of political power to stop governments introducing policies that will facilitate the transition to a low-carbon future. And so that's why that kind of approach from some types of environmentalists, I think, is very damaging. I mean, it's always been the case that people who want no action that will affect their commercial interests align themselves with people who can be characterised as environmentalists and friendly to their own interests. And that's, I think that has historically frequently been used to stop the kind of action that's necessary to tackle a problem. I mean, it's a classic political approach of those who have a commercial interest in the status quo or in very slow change.
So, Andy, is the primary problem here the entrenched power?
Well, this gets back to one of the big questions here, and one of the big differences between me and my old buddy Bill McKibben. We've been writing about this in lockstep since the '80s to get in our different ways. And this is this problem of big companies, or is this a problem that's more fundamental than that in terms of our needs for, what do you call it, a need, or our attachment to cheap energy? And I guess what I would say there is that ends up not being a scientific argument so much as a moral argument. This is sort of in Clive's sweet spot. It's about ethical imperatives, given the nature of what science is saying. But there you end up with this other ethical, if you make it into a moral argument, and you go to the parts of the world that haven't had their fossil fuel, that have no energy options except dung to cook their food on, or firewood that takes their children 3 or 4 hours to collect. That's immoral too, having a lack of energy. Ban Ki-moon has made the case beautifully for what he calls sustainable energy for all, meaning that it's just as much of an imperative to have those without energy that's necessary for refrigerating medicines and cleaning water and doing all kinds of things. It's just as much an imperative for them to have access to energy as it is for us to be talking about the need, which is again mostly future weighted to cut the growth of concentrations in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. So it's really a moral argument. And in terms of the science, there's one other batch of science that I got to touch on here, and I think it's being unscientific to ignore it. And this is the science, the social and behavioral science, that shows powerfully that more information, just chanting numbers, isn't the thing that changes people. And I'll take it from a very different realm, vaccination. There was just this recent work in pediatrics on people who are dug in against vaccinating their kids. If you give them more and more information that shows how powerfully vaccines work and how they're safe, it actually makes them more resistant to actually vaccinating their kids. I can't remember, Nathanael, I think you might even have written about this at one point. But it's so that it's unscientific to think that making the argument based just on science is going to change society when it's clear that it doesn't work that way.
But I'm certainly
I mean, and this, by the way, I'm saying this as someone who's spent now 31 years as a science writer trying to, convey rational stories about science.
Sure, but I mean, we have to take the situation and have an understanding about what we need to do in the future based on the science, based on the models, on the numbers, on the budgets, and so on. How we go about that is, of course, a social, political, and social psychological problem. And I've been writing about the failure of the information deficit model for years.
Yeah.
So Andy, I think it's mistaken to kind of elide those two questions. I mean, you have to take the science as it is for understanding where we're headed and what we need to do to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. When it comes to trying to work out responses and policies and how human beings are responding to the challenge, of course, that's not a scientific question, not a natural scientific question, but is, of course, one of politics and of an understanding of how people approach it. And in fact, it was me who first pointed out and argued that climate science denial made a transition from essentially an industry lobbying campaign in the 90s and early 2000s, the kind of thing that in Merchants of Doubt that's dealt with in great detail, but which I think misses the fundamental point, and that is in the sort of mid-2000s, climate science denial was completely transformed from an industry lobbying campaign into a deep political cultural question, as we see particularly in the US and to some extent in Australia. And that's why conservative voters suddenly became climate science deniers. They weren't in the 1990s. There was no difference in voting in beliefs about climate science between Republicans and Democrats in the 1990s. It was only when the deniers very successfully attached rejection of climate science to that broader set of conservative cultural and political beliefs that we really had a massive problem. So that's just sort of by the by. But I just wanted to challenge you, Andy, on this question of whether it's a problem of big corporations wielding their power or our attachment to cheap energy. In other words, you kind of shifted there from a political problem to a problem of consumer psychology. But I don't accept this. That we consumers in the West are somehow irrevocably attached to cheap energy, and you only need to look at the highly variable patterns of energy consumption between Western countries. It's easy for us in the United States and Australia with these sort of massive energy budgets that individuals have, and forget that in some countries, in Europe, for instance, they have less than half, a third of our emissions per person, and falling, and with strong public support. I'm thinking of Germany here, for policies that are rapidly cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So I think Western consumers can quite easily be weaned off high-polluting energy sources. And of course, the more that is done, the easier it becomes to free up carbon dioxide emissions within the budget for poor people who desperately need access to energy.
Yeah, by the way, that's an area where I think communication, again, one of the things that can be done is making sure that we're facilitating conveying those stories that there are you don't have to have high emissions to have high quality of life. To other communities that are still stuck, like in the United States, on high emissions trajectories. Although even, of course, in the States, emissions are down now at a rate that is pretty remarkable just from the shift from coal to gas. Of course, that's not going to solve the climate problem, given where we have to go, and given that most of the growth in emissions is coming in developing countries. But that's kind of circles back to what I'm trying to say, which is that I'll give you an example. You know, I can't remember. I'm still trying to get to bedrock on this statistic on how few U.S. congressmen have passports. Someone knows this number. Nathanael, I don't know if you've heard this. But if you haven't seen if you haven't seen an efficient rail system, then how do you know that you want one? There was a great example in Salt Lake City where, in the lead up to the Olympics, there, a little spur of light rail was put in. It was a lot of resistance and a lot of like, this will never work language at the time, and now they're trying to expand it because the community loves it. So demonstration, you know, getting things going, showing, finding trajectories. Steve Schneider, the great climate scientist, when he was in Australia for a year, actually gave a speech in which he talked about demonstrating success as a great step before you do the harder work of building regulations to restrict CO2, that kind of thing. And you know, so what I'm looking around for always is what are the things you could do that could actually make a difference? Getting the right information to the right people at the right time is one. Finding ways to convey those stories better. And by the way, just one way to get around the climate denial question is when you look at the same social and behavioral science, you see, as the 6 Americas studies at Yale have shown, that people on nearly the whole spectrum of views on global warming, people agree on energy efficiency and on the values of the value. In fact, on actually even paying more for efficiency if it requires that. That literature is just as informative on the enthusiasm for things like efficiency and innovation, even among people who disagree pretty vociferously on something like how serious is global warming. That, to me, is actionable information. It says you can actually make progress if you shift the discourse. But again, that gets away from this primacy, you know, this sort of rigorous, what's the word I'm looking for? The need to state the climate crisis as the prime concern. You know, I think there's ways forward, but they sometimes might require actually not doing that.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, as someone who was born in 1978 and grew up intensely aware of environmental degradation, you know, I've sort of watched these different strategies, and first was very much someone who believed what we really needed to do was to get society to come to grips with the horribleness of what was going on in order to force radical transformation. And you know, as the years went by, that started to seem less like that just wasn't going to happen. You know, that we weren't going to get away from capitalism or consumerism. And so I sort of became much more interested in kind of incremental approach. And you know, I can see the attractiveness of that. And I don't know if that, you know, if that conflicts, though. Do you see that? What do you think about that, Clive?
Well, we have to ask where it's going to lead. I mean, I think if we're realistic about what kind of changes that countries like United States and Australia, although perhaps it's not so much in our court now, we have to ask what that incremental approach is likely to lead to. And so this is what I guess this is the essential message that I'm communicating, that if we carry on as we are, even with quite good outcomes from the incremental approach, then we're screwed. I mean, that's just how the numbers look. And my argument in Requiem for a Species is that, you know, we can either face up to this or we don't. We carry on as though, you know, we're just not going to think about it. We're going to tell stories to ourselves about how it must be exaggerated, or we can imagine that, well, you know, it looks bad, but some technology will come along and everything will be okay. Or we can do what I did, and which plenty of other people have done, is look at it with open eyes and allow it to blast away all of our utopian imaginings and say, well, we, the world, the earth, is in really deep trouble, and it's extremely unlikely that we're going to get out of it. So what do we do in that situation? I mean, this is what a lot of people, including George Monbiot and Bill McKibben, are grappling with. How do we, as concerned citizens, activists, intellectuals, deal with that? And what does that mean for how we act? Does it mean we simply go along with the incremental, muddle-through kind of approach, even though we understand that the consequences are likely to be catastrophic? Or do we try to fundamentally rethink and change strategies? And I think that's what the environment movement is grappling with, this really deep, difficult problem, because past understandings and past campaigning strategies are manifestly inadequate for the problem that we confront.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question for me is, what does rethinking and reassessing strategies look like? Because as a young man growing up with this, it was sort of like this barrage of awfulness and then paralysis. What do how the only first step would be kind of radical cultural revolution, and I didn't exactly know how to key that off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I don't have an answer to that, mate, but except to say this, the only thing the first thing we must do is face up to the facts, not to lie to ourselves or to other people about the situation. Look, many of us are left in this kind of limbo state where we realise things are very bad, reluctantly, actually worse than we thought, much worse. So how do we respond to that? Well, it's very tempting, and I say that as someone who is seriously tempted towards it at times, to say, well, it really can't be that bad. Maybe the science has got it wrong. Maybe climate sensitivity will turn out to be 1 degree rather than 3 degrees. Maybe there's some feedback, negative feedback that we're not aware of, that'll come online soon. You can pick up on bits of good news. There was a great bit yesterday about the disappearance of plastic in the ocean. And just kind of hope that we'll get by, something will happen and we'll be okay. And, it's a tempting strategy. What sticks in my craw, though, is when that kind of thinking is taken up and used as a reason by powerful interests who are stopping real action on climate change, as a way of diverting attention from their own responsibility for stopping action on climate change. So that's my reason for criticising elements of the environment movement, such as the Breakthrough Institute, who allow themselves to become, wittingly or otherwise, really the patsies for big corporations.
Andy, you want to jump in here? Or?
Well, it's there are many conundrums here. Of course, one is I think people generally, whether it's from our primordial campfire beginnings or not, we tend to like bad stories better than good stories. This Kim Stanley Robinson has written about. He's a climate novelist, science fiction writer, who writes. God, I forgot what he calls them. It's not dystopian. It's hard to sell something that's not dystopian. It's hard to get attention for. I guarantee you, stories about maybe the ocean plastic is degrading are a harder sell on the front page of a newspaper than stories about, oh my God, there's a swirling vortex of plastic in the middle of the Pacific, even though it's not really like that. So first of all, we have a tendency, not just in the media but in the public imagination, to embrace in an asymmetrical way the dire. And as a reporter, I found it again over 30 years of this stuff. I've written plenty of dire stories. In fact, I spoke about that in my lecture again early on. I talk about having written plenty of both "Woe Is Me" and "Shame on You" stories, and they're useful. They're important. But if we are biased toward that end of the spectrum, then we're missing potential outcomes that might be less sexy, but that actually take the world through this. What I see as kind of a wave poised to hit a beach, and not consider paths that might take us on through that without a crash. And I wrote in this piece, like for example, the Antarctic disintegration. That, as I'm sure you both know, is the recent studies that showed that there's an inevitability over many centuries timescale of many feet of sea level rise from Antarctica, but setting aside in Greenland. And when I wrote about that stuff, I got three people to weigh in who have long time scales: an astrobiologist, Kim Stanley Robinson, the novelist, and Kurt Steger, who wrote that book about the next 100,000 years. And I included my own thoughts, which draw partly on work at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. They do this like population analysis on that show many trajectories. Some are sort of soft landing trajectories around 2300, the year 2300, with 3 billion people prosperous people on a planet. And when you think about that, is there a path toward 3 billion people and getting there not through mass death, but through just demographic transitions? By 2300, I guarantee you that world will be a lot more able to deal with a rise in sea levels through that span of a number of feet than a world of 10 or 12 billion struggling people. So there are paths that can be perceived as, if not good, at least certainly far better than other alternatives. And I think by trying to focus a little attention in a world wedded to woe is me and shame on you, and partially through the work of people like me and others, it's really important to make sure that we can convey alternatives and not shy away from it because it might be convenient to some company that likes the way things are. I mean, I'm not going to not write something because it's convenient to anybody, if I think it's factual.
Mm-hmm.
I just briefly respond by saying that I don't know, Andy, about people liking doom stories. I mean, the publishing industry is turning away plenty of books saying, sorry, this is too bleak. People don't want to read about how the world is doomed, and that was kind of reinforced by a new book which I launched the other day, Poison Planet, by Julian Cribb, on the penetration of organic chemicals in everywhere. It's quite an extremely depressing book, actually. But again, he had trouble with it, finding a publisher, and once he had a publisher, then the marketing people wanted to change the title to make it, less bleak. So the publishing industry has a very strong view that they've had plenty of the world has ended kind of books, and they don't want any more because the public doesn't want to hear about it.
I'm not so sure the public wants to read any books anymore, which is why that's the other issue.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, just to sum up, clearly we have major cultural issues to work out. I don't see a giant revolution in us rising to a higher state anytime soon, although I certainly welcome that and work for it. But it seems like in the meantime, that it doesn't hurt to be working on these incremental, pragmatic measures with this full awareness that it's primarily a political fight with entrenched interests working against it. I mean, at least that gives us the option of if there are less bad alternatives out there, making our way toward them.
Well, look, I'd agree with that, and in the sense that, I do it. I mean, in all sorts of ways contribute to incremental approaches, including incremental campaigning approaches, when I can help out or give advice to environment groups. Mind you, I've got much more time for those who are engaged in civil disobedience and are really trying to take on the system. But but the danger, Nate, in that, it doesn't hurt to be engaged in these incremental approaches, is that it might hurt in the sense that it can serve as a distraction. It can serve as a way of giving people who have the responsibility to take more far-reaching action, it gives them an opportunity and excuse to do very little. And we see a classic case of this in Australia right now. We've got a Conservative government that is really a government of climate deniers. I mean, Tony Abbott has famously said climate science is crap. He knows he can't say that, to the public, because 80% of Australians believe climate change is a problem and 60% of them believe it's a serious problem. And so what does he do? He abolishes the carbon price and wants to abolish the renewable energy target, two policies that are having a substantial impact on Australia's energy economy, and is introducing what he calls a direct action program, which is really fiddling around with, soil carbon and growing some trees and paying people to do some energy efficiency. And his direct action program, which is just taking, pursuing some incremental approaches, is a substitute politically for policies that were starting to make a difference. So that's the danger. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with pursuing an incremental approach, given that the kind of radical transformation some of us would prefer is not going to happen in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Except
insofar as that incremental approach undermines more substantial action.
And there are cases, I think that there are cases when it does, as you've just, that there's a one-for-one either-or option.
Well, although it's not either-or, given, and I've written about this repeatedly, Australia, domestic climate policy in Australia, the impact of that, when it's not considering the exports of coal to China, is, to me, ridiculous. And by the way, it's the same for any developed country that's exporting a lot of fossil fuel. It's whose carbon, and everyone says, oh yeah, but China, someday they'll count those emissions on their end. It's not something we need to keep track of under our cap in Australia. So it's not even, I think there's maybe perhaps been too much of a sense that Australia did something significant with its domestic policies again, I'm not saying Australia alone is to blame for this kind of thing, but when you look with a global lens at the flows of carbon that way, I think it's just important to do that. Same thing with a lot of industry moving out of Europe. So the cap was tightened, but a lot of the manufacturing moved to Asia. Is that success or not?
In Australia, the environment groups, I think quite rightly in recent years, have done a lot to shift attention from domestic emissions to coal exports. But there's kind of a conspiracy. There is no conspiracy, but there's a kind of, it's a fact that the media, the politicians, nobody other than environment groups wants to talk about Australia's coal exports. So, I agree entirely that Australia could halve its greenhouse gas emissions.
And by the way, I'm not saying that social pressure on companies and on governments is not important. I mean, it's all part of what I agree that I would love to see diversity in the sense that there's a lot of value for me in the divestment campaign on campuses. I don't think it'll be meaningful in terms of carbon in the long run, given how markets work, but I think it's a vital discussion, because it's in the end a moral discussion about what's our endowment. Literally, when students are starting to clamor about what is our endowment, meaning this school's endowment, is it just the money and the CDs and other investments, or is it bigger than that? That's vital, and so I'm all for it. And I don't mean, and I'm not sure. Again, I'm just trying to sort of, my role in this, and everyone has a different role, is to be sort of looking at the whole picture Some people say that's a cop-out. You're just stepping out of the fray. But it's just my part of the process. And, you know, I've championed some things Greenpeace has done, and I've decried some things Greenpeace has done in other places. I think there's a role for everybody in this whole big landscape, trying to shape a good path in a turbulent time.
Perhaps, Clive, would you prefer a good path to a good Anthropocene? Is that
I would prefer it. If I retitled that, it would be that.
Well, I mean, I'd prefer a better Anthropocene than it would otherwise be. I just think it's
it's really wordsmith. Can you really? That's much more clumsy.
It's clumsy, but it's true. I just think it's wrong to put, as Betsy said, it's wrong to put good and Anthropocene together. I think it's misleading, and it covers over something very serious that we human beings have to face up to, and by transforming it into something that we can embrace, I think is very dangerous and misleading. And so, yes, there can, as I argued in my comment to Andy, I think, yes, it's a question of a bad or a less bad Anthropocene, not a bad or a good one. There are a whole range of paths that could be pursued into the Anthropocene, but it's hard to see any of them leading to, the kind of bold utopian future that social democrats and others used to imagine in the good old days when we used to have ideologies rather than earth system science telling us about how the future could be.
Well, I'd like to wrap this up here because this is going to take me forever to transcribe. but I'll give you each a chance to, if you have any last words or something you feel like you wanted to say that you haven't had a chance to.
Well, the last thing I would say is the sort of in having this I won't call it an epiphany, but the last few years having this shift in my own focus from numbers, goals that are numbers, to goals that are qualities, like qualities in society. There's a resonant metaphor which I mentioned at the end of my talk, and that's considering looking down at your kids. I have two boys, one 16, one 23, and when they were little, I could have sat there and looked at them sleeping in their beds and gone, boy, I'd really like them to be doctors making $400,000 when they're older. And we all have dreams for our kids, those of us who have kids. And more recently, I think I would look at them and say, what are the traits I would want to maximize in these two stem cells, these two kids who have not grown into anything yet, to maximize their chances of thriving and being productive and collaborative and generous and everything else that you would want in a 21st century society. But what it requires, the shift from the one sort of, I want to make this kid's life good, to the, I want this kid to have good qualities, requires letting go. And it's really scary. I mean, it's really scary for me just considering my own kids letting go of control. And I think with society and where we're at as a species right now, heading into this 21st century, seeing that we've only had a few decades in which we've had sort of a crystallizing but still murky view of our impacts on the planet and our fellow passengers on the planet, that I have to let go of a sense that I can, that this is a controllable thing so much. But I do know that I have power potentially to share ideas, to teach students, to work in my community in ways that can get us the trajectories in a way that I won't regret. And so that's kind of like where I'm at. And I think you can have an optimism in that sense, but it requires letting go. And it doesn't mean there's no grief either. When I wrote my piece about the disappearance of the baiji, the river dolphin in the Yangtze, it was a wrenching thing to have to write. But there's that too. That's part of it.
It's an optimism for the process as opposed to the endpoints.
Yeah, and also we don't really know what our grandchildren are going to want.
Yeah,
and that requires letting go.
Well, I mean, I'm interested and sympathetic to your comments there, Andy. I think there is a grieving process that anyone who looks at the earth and where we're headed has to go through, because, as you've indicated, grieving is a process of letting go of that which is dead or approaching death. And as I talk about this quite a lot in Requiem for a Species, I think we do have to go through a grieving process where what has died is our conception of the future, and that is a conception which has been around for perhaps 200 or 300 years, or has been emerging for 200 or 300 years since the Industrial Revolution and essentially the start of modernisation. The idea that whatever happens, we are moving into a brighter future where everything will be improving and everything will be getting better. And I think now we face a situation where that's no longer a benign fiction, but a dangerous delusion. And so, in that circumstance, what do? I think that what Andy is saying is, from a personal point of view, a very kind of valid way, perhaps the only valid way of responding to the situation when we do look at our children, and that is to say, well, I and other well-intentioned people can't build a grand society in which they will be able to live and flourish, but it's going to be a world of trials and difficulties, but humans do flourish in those circumstances as well. I mean, humans, of course, suffer in those circumstances, but humans can also flourish. And so the idea of our children and grandchildren going into that kind of world and finding fulfillment in it is something that, I find very attractive. Now, maybe it's a psychological balm that we apply, but nevertheless, I think it's not a bad way of thinking about the future and how those we love will survive and flourish in it.
All right. Well, I appreciate you both. Thank you for. I feel like I've learned a lot in this last hour.
Nate, thank you for doing it. For adjudicating or whatever, for just facilitating it. It's a really important discussion, and the first step is just, I do think, and this is where Betsy Colbert's book and other it's really important for humans to at least start to integrate the reality that we are at a time in our history as a species when the world is more than ever what we choose to make of it.